On this computer. Okay, you're good.
Fantastic, thank you. Throughout this class, if anyone does have any problems understanding, hearing me, anything like that, please go ahead and shoot a message in there. Ursula will be able to help out and just make sure that everything's as clear as possible for everyone. So the main purpose of why I wanted to do this class is I get a lot of people with questions on how to get into really building your persona and how to use archaeological experimentation to do that. And I know from my own personal experience, it can seem really intimidating at first. I think we all hear from people that just getting into the arts and sciences can be really scary. Whether or not it's from the perspective that you worry that, you know, laurels or these people that are just going to come and be judgmental and tell you all the things you're doing wrong, or whether or not it's just the concern that, you know, you're not already a scholar. How do you even go about researching something? And the one thing we hear from everyone that I personally did not believe when I was first hearing it from people was no one starts as a master at their craft. No one is an expert to begin with, and everyone has a huge learning curve. And I'm at that great intermediate spot right now where I remember exactly what it was like when I was first starting and hearing those things from people saying, oh, you know, you just work at it and before you know it, you'll be doing things that you would never have imagined you were doing. And I remember thinking, yeah, whatever. You don't know what you're talking about. You don't know how completely unskilled I am. And I am now at that point where I'm doing stuff that 3, 4, 5 years ago, if you told me I was going to be doing that, I would have said you were an idiot. But I'm also at the point where I'm not a laurel. You know, I'm not able to say, well, this stuff I'm doing, this is laurel quality work, even if it's just hanging up a pair of drapes in the living room. So I'm able to speak from the point of saying, I remember how intimidating it was. I remember how scary it was and how unbelievable it sounds when people say to you, yes, one day you'll be doing things you would never have dreamed of. But I also know what that learning curve is like and how much you can achieve. The main way I've done it is by doing archaeological experimentation and using that as a way to help me build my persona and my knowledge. Now, I try to be honest with everyone I speak to. I'm doing this as someone who is not college educated. I don't have 4 years worth of essays under my belt where I had to research it and use, you know, this particular style of notation for my documentation, anything like that. I had to come in and learn it all myself. And I was lucky to have a number of amazing people who really helped me learn how to do that. And I've done what I can to try and break those things down and make them as minimally intimidating as possible. So for me, my starting point with building and understanding my persona and using archaeological experimentation to do that was to sit down and think about, okay, of the little things I know, what kind of stuff would my persona be doing on a daily basis? And why in my modern life do on a daily basis, and where can I figure out that those things differ? So I like to kind of sit with people and work with them and talk to them about, okay, you know, where's your persona from? So as a starting point, what kind of things would they be eating? Everyone has to eat. Everyone throughout history has, at least at some point in their life, eaten. When we think about medieval feasts, a lot of us think about the sort of high Elizabethan stuff, where, you know, you're having a roast chicken that is absolutely slathered in sugar and syrup and 10 tons of cinnamon. And we think about, oh, I don't like that. There's no way I'd eat that. So here's your starting point. Think about, what do I know that I like to eat? What sorts of things can I figure out that my persona ate? And you might not know. You might have no clue. So that's your starting point when you Google. You're going to sit down and say your persona is 12th century German. You're just going to Google 12th century German food, and you're going to see what comes up. And when those pages come up, what you are looking for in those pages is someone who's using any kind of citation that says, here's a thing from an archaeological dig. Here's a thing that is from a book on 12th century food. Here's a thing that is saying it's based on a 12th century recipe. You're going to be looking for those basic things. And then you can sit down and look at the ingredients. Okay, they're making a chicken dish. If I was making a chicken dish, what would I be using? Well, maybe I would grab a roast chicken from the store and then tear that all apart and throw it in a pot, and I would have some garlic and Mrs. Dash salt, whatever, and that's how I cook it. And then look at that recipe and you try and interpret it as much as you can. They're saying they roast the chicken, they add in some wild garlic, and they add in some dandelion root. Well, there you've got one big difference. So one of the things you can do is a very first, very simple step into archaeological experimentation is you can say, hey, I'm going to make a meal. I'm going to sit down and make a completely modern chicken meal the way I would make one that is as much as I can manage based on this period recipe. And then you have your friends over and you have them do a blind taste test. And you sit down and say, okay, which one do you think is the historical recipe and which one is the modern recipe? And beyond that, you say, which one do you like more and why? And from there, you can sit down and say, okay, about half of the room preferred the modern one, about half of them preferred the medieval one. But the reasons they gave were really interesting. Maybe the people who liked the medieval one said, oh, it's kind of got a really strong, gamey flavour that you don't get a lot. And it has these sort of herbal flavours, but they're slightly fruity and it's really unusual. And then you can put that down to, okay, these are things that are distinct personal taste. But then you go into stuff like how many people said, oh, I hate gamey flavoured stuff. I only really eat chicken nuggets at home. Then you can say, okay, this is something that is a more modern taste. This is something that our modern palate's not used to. Everyone with me so far? Anyone get any questions with that? Looks like we're good on that. And again, if you do have any questions, anything you want to talk about, please go ahead and jump in. So one of the next things I like to suggest for people, what sort of things do you do on a daily basis that would be wildly different for your persona? And a really, really simple one for that is to say, okay, I have to go grocery shopping and get supplies. And you can look at your persona and say, you know, reasonably, yeah, maybe they had their own little garden and they got some of their supplies out of that. And maybe they did have a couple of livestock and they were able to get something from that. But unless you were the highest of the high, it's unlikely that all of your food and stuff would be bought and provided for you without you ever having to set foot outside your house. So another really simple way to ease into archaeological experimentation is to say, okay, maybe I'm not going to put on my full garb to go to the store, but I understand that my persona, even if they had an access to a horse, they might not have ridden that horse everywhere. And they might have had access to an old nag, but they didn't necessarily have a working wagon. So when they were going to the local market, they went on foot. So you say, okay, I'm going to go to the store and buy a couple of days worth of groceries, and I'm going to do it on foot. Well, how are you going to transport it? They didn't have plastic bags. So you sit down and you think about, okay, what can I find from my period? And you Google things like 14th century backpack or 13th century transportation. And you start finding pictures, woodcuts, anything like that from the period. And you say, okay, I can see a lot of people carrying things around in wicker baskets. So you hit the thrift store, you find a $2 wicker basket that's as close as possible to what you see in those pictures. And you're going to go to the grocery store. You don't even have to bother being in garb. And you go and you pick up a couple of days worth of groceries and you bring it home and you do it all on foot. and pay attention to all the little details. Are you someone that is used to doing all of their shopping in the car, and you've never had to walk a mile from the grocery store back to your house carrying all the stuff? Is it uncomfortable? Is that discomfort more to do with the strain on the basket on your hip because you're not used to that kind of basket shape and it's bumping against you the whole time? Or is it that your arms are getting really tired? Or is it that you're getting really footsore because you're not used to walking that kind of a distance all in one go? These are all little things you can be paying attention to that's going to make a big difference for you. You can very gradually build yourself up from there. So one of the things I've done that I know a lot of people on here have seen the various pictures on is that I've been working on building various backpacks that are appropriate for my persona. So this is my most recent one that I use, and I've been building these and going on hikes with them and testing them out. So as some of you may remember, some may not, the very first one that I built, I looked at the archaeological finds and what the various archaeologists had said was the most likely iteration of this. And I said, a wicker backpack, that seems it's going to break really easily, that's super dumb. I'm going to make one out. And so I made one out of leather, and I made the straps out of basically tablet woven band. And then I went on a 2-day long hike with it. And I came back from that at the end with huge bruises over both shoulders, all the way down. Some of them had cut all the way through so that the skin was bleeding underneath. And so I was able to say, okay, well, this is a terrible idea. We can assume that people in history were not complete idiots who would hurt themselves for no reason. And these straps are not going to work. You know, they cut in too much, they stretch out in a weird way, they are not feasible. The next thing I learned was that leather, while I thought it was a lot easier, well, for one thing, it would have been a lot more expensive than weaving your wicker, something that a lot of people had much easier access to. But that leather, as it flexed and bent, it also pulled the stitches, and so I ended up with gaps all over the backpack. So I came back and I said, okay, well, I'm going to try and weave one out of wicker, but I still want it to be waterproof. What might they have done? Well, I'm going to do a fabric liner. And what documentation can I find of any ways to make anything waterproof before rubber arrived? Well, when you search, you go on Google and you look for historical waterproofing, you can find a ton of references on people waterproofing linen using beeswax, waterproofing wool fabric using seal fat, all of these sorts of things. So I was able to give it a go and waterproof a bag and use that as a liner. I was able to weave it out of wicker, and as you can see, it's super not even, it's super not pretty, but it's really good for a first attempt. It does exactly the job I need. And then I went in and I put on leather straps, and I tried it out and I found it worked a lot better. It fixed a lot of those problems I had. It was lighter overall, even when I packed it full of 2-3 days worth of camping stuff. It didn't cut into my shoulders the same way. As the wicker flexed, it molded to my back, so it was comfortable to wear, but the liner kept it waterproof. And then I was able to do something that was a really big leap for me, which was I was able to start Googling about soil conditions. And I was able to find a really thorough paper all about the soil conditions in Gokstad, where this style of backpack was found, where it discussed in detail what sorts of things survived in that soil. So I was able to reference, okay, well, the top and bottom wooden panels, the things that we do have surviving, those survive really well in that soil. But leather straps, wicker bodies, fabric line, they would not have survived. They would not even have survived enough to leave an imprint in the soil. So I was able to learn from that and say, okay, my guesses at how this might be working, having used it and found all of these various faults, my guesses were pretty good guesses. And had I not actually used it, had I not gone on that first hike and said, hey, this is terrible, none of this is working the way I expected it to, I would not have been able to make more guesses and say, okay, what things caused me extreme discomfort beyond just being a modern person who's not necessarily used to hauling everything in this style of backpack. And so you can start taking those gradual steps and slowly learning how to make those guesses. Everyone still with me so far? Anyone have any questions, anything you want to discuss?
I don't know if you're going to move on to this next, and if you are, I apologize for interrupting. But something that really struck me when you were talking about the food and how everybody ate, the other thing everybody did was cook.
They did.
So I don't know if cooking techniques is part of what you're going to talk about, or?
It is indeed. That's something I was going to be going on to short.
Okay, then cool, awesome. Thank you.
No worries. So my very first ever archaeological experimentation project was something that I didn't know that's what I was doing at the time. And I decided that I was going to make a Viking meal. And my basis for this was, I know the Vikings ate differently. What did they have access to? So I literally just Googled Viking food archaeological finds. And I found all sorts of wonderful listings of things that had been found in archaeological digs. So I say, okay, well, we know the Vikings had a lot of meals, but they were mainly using things like beef, pork, chicken, lamb, that kind of thing. They did have meals with things like venison, but those seem to have been a lot rarer. And from there, I could go on and find information that showed that Vikings were a lot more interested in farming. Their hunting was more something that they did for sport. They weren't necessarily hunting for food. Your average person would have had some kind of small holding, and that's how they were getting most of their meat supply. And when you look at what they were using to spice it, you see a lot of wild herbs. You see wild rosemary, wild garlic, wild onions, all of that sort of thing. And so I decided to sit down and go through all of that and say, okay, what might an average Viking meal have looked like? And I was able to find out that your average Viking meal would have been some sort of dried or smoked fish, some sort of super stew that would have maybe some meat in it, lots of different kinds of beans, and they would have had some sort of flatbread or crackers to go with that, and then something a little bit desserty, which is very similar to your modern meals. And so I decided I was going to do, for the Uprising Artisans display, I was going to do a full Viking meal. So I went out and I got a hold of some fish and I smoked it. And the first thing I did was I said, well, how did they smoke fish? Because I'd heard, living in Idaho, you hear all of these people, well, I got my venison and I smoked it with the finest fruit woods and hickory and I did it in these proportions. And I could not find anything in the writing and the archaeological finds, anything like that, that showed they were using special woods to do smoking. Everything that I could find suggested that they literally just hung the fish or the meat, whatever they were smoking, on these little frames made out of twigs and put them next to the fire, whatever they happened to be using for their firewood that day. So I got my salmon and I smoked it using terrible, terrible old pine wood that I'd gathered from my yard. And this was like not even nice pine wood. This was like wormhole trash pine wood with dirt all over it. But it was nice and dry. It was for fire, so I used that and I smoked some fish. And then I made a sort of soup slash stew using beans that would have been available in period and a couple of so a little bit of salt. My flavorings, my seasonings were pretty much just garlic in lieu of wild garlic, which is a lot harder to get here. I managed to get hold of some of the style onions, things like that. Nettles, some watercress, things that we had in the archaeological finds, and I made a soup with that. And then I got hold of some skyr, which is a Viking cheese that's kind of like yogurt, and mashed that up with some fresh berries. And then I had some of my homebrewed beer. And then I made just a couple of really simple oatcakes. And I put this meal together and I served it to people. The soup was served cold. I asked people to taste everything, see how they felt about it. And then every single person that came through, I asked them, what kind of wood do you think the fish was smoked with? And I had so many people saying, oh, this is delicious. This is some of the best smoked fish I've had. This is really good. You know, this must be hickory. This must be apple wood. I had one person saying this must be peach wood, all of this stuff. And every single one of them was astonished when I said it was just smoked over some terrible old pine wood I found in my yard. Because we're so used to these modern ideas of how these things are done. So going to that very simple level of cooking, trying to use those period ingredients and asking people to just taste it and then tell you what they think, what their impression is. And you can do this in a lot of ways. You can do something like say, okay, I'm going to smoke some sausages and I'm going to smoke them over a fire with some really wet wood rather than using a modern smoker. Or you can say, I'm going to try cooking a stew over an open flame instead of cooking it in the kitchen and see what difference that makes. Am I using period cookware? Do I have a cast iron pot I can use that is a little bit closer to period cookware rather than using, you know, my modern Teflon coated pot? Those little steps can make a big difference. And from there, you can kind of slowly work. I'm learning about what the different palettes are. I'm learning about the different methods for cooking and what challenges those present versus what different flavors they bring into it. Does that seem reasonable to everyone so far?
Yeah, I think you covered that really well. And one of the things, the reason that I was hoping you would is, for me, my interest in history goes further back to the medieval ages. Like if you aren't banging stone rocks together to make fire and you fancy people with your pottery, you know, I've been to the really ancient stuff. But something that occurred to me the other day is, and getting past the intimidation factor, if you own a crock pot, you are already using historical cooking method.
Exactly.
If you got a tangine for Hanukkah like I was lucky enough to, you're doing ancient style of cooking in an ancient vessel. So a lot of people are already doing historical cooking. They just have to like reframe how they see the appliances and stuff they already have. If you own a wooden spoon, you are doing archaeological cooking.
Exactly. And that's the big thing, is it's really learning to discern what we consider to be just modern experiences versus what we see as you know, period available tools and how they made a difference with us.
Yeah, I think that's
so
a really
kind
good
of
way
jumping
to put
on, one of the things that I personally like to do, and I get a lot of raised eyebrows about this. I get a lot of people telling me that I'm making things way more complicated than they need to be. But one of the things that I started doing was making my own period appropriate tools, or buying them if it wasn't something I could make, and using those. And you know, I had at one point the amazing Sir Leia Dispenser comment to me when she was reading over my documentation. He started by cutting down the tree because of course he did. And it was this very strange moment of like pride and embarrassment for me, because I don't want to be someone who is making things ridiculously complicated. And I don't want to be someone who's doing things in a way that intimidates other people. But for me, I found that doing stuff like using period tools made me really realize on a very visceral level exactly how different the experience was of making even an everyday thing. Right down to something like fixing the fence that the cows burst through yet again. It's a completely different experience when you're using these hand tools. And you can sit down and think about it, and as you slowly get better with those things, think about, well, this is what this person was used to, and they'd been doing it since they were kids, so they would have been a lot faster than me. But when you think about the very simple physical level, how that person's day would have gone, even if they'd gotten to be an expert with these tools, how much longer it would have taken them to do something. So one thing I'd like to show you guys, to give just a brief example, I made what is referred to as a T-handle drill. And if you imagine, it's basically a drill bit where the bottom section looks a little bit more like a chisel. It's not spiraled like a modern drill bit. And then it has a wooden handle across the top. And basically you would drill a hole by pressing it against the wood and then twisting it like a corkscrew until you're through the wood. Now, when I was making these backpacks, I would use that. And I don't know if you guys can see, but every single piece of wicker there is put through a hole. The very first time I made one of these backpacks, I didn't think about how my persona would have had all sorts of things that they were doing on a daily basis, and that they would maybe in the evening after dinner before they go to bed drill 2 or 3 holes in the piece of wood for the backpack working. I sat down one afternoon and decided to drill all of the holes. And I have arthritis in my hands, and by the end of drilling all of those holes, I was exhausted and in agony. And it helped me to really realize that these people would not have been saying, this is the one project I'm working on while I have a break from my, modern office job. They would have been constantly working on lots of little things. So that was one small thing where using a period tool helped me really gain an understanding for this world. Making these the wooden tops and bolts, I got a log and I had some wooden wedges and a mallet that I made, and I split the planks of wood from the log. It's a process called riving. And then from there I would take my draw knife and I would gradually smooth them all out because they didn't have sandpaper at period. And I learned a lot about what a difference that makes to the final wood product. So these pieces of wood, they do not split or break nearly as easily as wood that has been put through a modern sawmill. Because basically what you're doing when you rive that wood, when you split it from the log, what you're doing is you're tearing apart the weak sections where those grains are not as strongly combined. And then once you've torn it apart, what you have left is stronger wood. It has a much denser weave of those grains. And so after you smooth it off, you've got something that's going to stand up to a lot more wear and tear. It makes a big difference. But one of the things that was really a huge eye-opener for me as far as the difference between modern tools and period tools was not even something that I was working on. It was my wife, the lady Ursula. And she has been working a phenomenal amount on the difference between modern drop spinning and period drop spinning. And she's been involved in a lot of groups. She's done a ton of research, but it's all focused on, in the medieval period, when people were using a drop spindle, it was very different from a modern drop spindle. You didn't have your little hook on the top. You didn't have your particular way that you wound it, and they were using a distaff. And she was coming from having spent a few years, using a modern drop spindle and trying to switch to using a period drop spindle. And she learned not just how different the technique is. You'll have to excuse the dog barking. There's some children going by, and that's not allowed, obviously. She had been working really hard on transitioning from using a modern drop spindle to a period drop spindle and using a distaff, which is basically, your big stick of wood. This is where the idea of, a witch having her wand comes from. And so she learned you could basically take your distaff and you could stick it in your belt. You would have your fabric, your raw wool that you were spinning from, basically wrapped around the end. And then you would have your drop spindle and you would be using both hands, pulling that out and then spinning from there. And she learned after quite a while doing this that it made a huge difference just in the way she physically moved when she was spinning. She could do it for much longer periods of time. She wasn't exhausted. She wasn't getting the back pain from kind of hunching over the whole time. She wasn't getting the sore wrists from spinning for a really long time, pulling it back up. It made this massive difference in how she was able to spin and how long she was able to spin. And watching her do that and learning her talk about that, it really made me start focusing on how very different things are physically when we are using those period tools and materials versus when we're using modern tools and materials. So I would start paying attention when I was doing my woodworking, and I would be using my totally normal little fold out bench for when I was doing my woodworking, and I would be kind of hunched over it. And if I used power tools, after a while my hand was shaking. I didn't want to do that any longer. And when I started using those period tools, when I was using draw knives, things like that, instead of standing up over a bench and hunching over something that was too short for me, even as a short person, I was like, okay, well, how would they have been doing this in period? And I was able to find, by Googling Viking tools, Viking woodworking, Viking tool bench, things like that, I was able to find examples where I could see, well, they would have a bench that they were sitting at. They would have a method where it was basically like a plank of wood with something on the end where they could be sitting down, holding it between their legs. The thing that they were working on is clamped at the top, and they're going ahead, they're using their draw knife, they're carving away, but they were able to sit comfortably while they did it. They weren't standing, leaning over a bench, getting that lower backache the whole time. All of these techniques, these tools that they were using, were devised for people that were doing this for long periods of their day. They were designed for people that were doing this as part of their everyday life. And they were, it made this huge difference to me mentally to start thinking about that. So I'm going to take that, I'm going to jump on to the sort of next topic that comes from that. But before I do that, I want to, anyone have any other questions, anything they want to comment on?
I was thinking when you were talking about the amount of time that you put into even just making the tools, so that you can then put the time into making the thing, and it gives you context for some other cultural things. Like, we see historical records or court records where someone has stolen a basket and they get some horrible harsh punishment, and we're like, it's a basket. I mean, how could this be? Why is this such a big deal? It's not like they stole your horse or your kid or something. But when you think about the investment of time and energy that basket represents, and the cost, again, in time and energy, because you can only do so many things in a day,
you can put just Olivia.
It just gives you a context. I think it really helps you understand a broader context of some other things in the overall cultural situation.
They'll see your presentation.
Mm-hmm. No, you're absolutely right. And what that makes me think of, again, something that Lady Ursula discovered and that she put me onto. There's an amazing book called Women's Work. I believe that the official title, and Lady will correct me, is it's called Women's Work, the First 2,000 Centuries or something like that.
The first 20,000 years. Yeah, it's a wonderful resource. It's specifically about fiber crafts, so spinning and weaving primarily. But yeah, it's a really cool resource that talks about the value of labor. I mean, one of the things that you sometimes hear about the period is that materials were expensive and people were cheap, whereas today materials are cheap and people are expensive. You would have serfs or slaves or people like that in your life who could theoretically sit and spin all day long every single day of their lives, or whatever, dig turnips or whatever the skill is. And it actually, that kind of dovetails on a point I wanted to try and make, which is that it can be really intimidating to get into a craft like this and think about, okay, do I need to grow the grain myself before I bake bread for a competition? And no, you don't, because we are modern people who don't have 30 serfs to take care of our fields for us or whatever. Yeah, Prax just mentioned the name in the chat, Elizabeth Barber. She's written several books and she's wonderful. She's very readable and interesting. And I think Mr. Stiliana has my copy of that book. But so it's okay to take one little chunk and play with it. So for example, if I wanted to learn about weaving on a warp weighted loom, I could do that, but that doesn't mean I have to first spend 2 years spinning the yarn on a spindle. I can go ahead and go buy yarn and say, my persona would have had someone to do this for them. It can get really intimidating to think, oh, the only way this is going to be worthy of display or of submission is if I, first light the fire with a splint myself and go from there. And with archaeological experimentation, the key to not getting stressed out about it is to take one small chunk and play with that and say, okay, I'm going to make a dish where I churn the butter myself and I buy all the other ingredients from the store, so I can really focus in on that one thing, because we don't have the time. We have full-time jobs and we're just one person, as opposed to being in a community that had a specialization of labor where not everyone did everything each step of the way.
Exactly.
Can I jump in after that?
Please do.
I'd say, so for starters, absolutely. Like when I'm teaching somebody like the basics of a skill, I am not going to use oh yeah, fine, I can start my video. I'm not going to use the super curious materials. I'm not going to use expensive materials. When I learned how to do what I'm doing right now, which is this double face, I was using crochet cotton because to hell with that. I'm just going to assume that this is going to be garbage, right? Because we start off a skill by sucking at that skill. And that's where we're supposed to start off. Nobody starts off good. So use the cheap, easy stuff while you're starting. But when you start wondering, and this is where I segue off, where it's like when you start wondering, maybe I'll do something for competition. That's where my suggestion is, okay, still don't spin the stuff unless, Ursula, that's your thing. Unless that's your jam. Don't spin the thread.
Right, but maybe the project.
Right, exactly. That's a different project.
Yeah.
But maybe now, instead of going out and getting the crochet cotton, consider going out and getting maybe linen, or wool is certainly a different beast, but consider, yeah, you're still buying the stuff, but maybe buy something that's a little bit closer to what they would have used. They would have used wool or linen, for instance, and they wouldn't have used cotton. On the other hand, just as an aside, if you're still not sure about your skill level, if you think maybe this might be garbage because of my skill, not because of the pain in the butt factor of this material, then stick with the crochet cotton. Like, I think that the entries that are out there that are crochet cotton, those are awesome too. But consider advancing in materials without having to advance and making your more scratch from scratch.
Which is what they did. I mean, if you think about it, when they were teaching their 3 and 4 and 5-year-olds how to spin or how to weave, they didn't go, get me the most expensive fleece from my finest animals, for I will teach little Muffin here how to spin. Because little Muffin is going to turn out crap that we're going to use to tie the chickens in the kitchen.
Your tablet woven project will absolutely be used to tie future tablet woven projects onto your belt or your loom. That is the purpose. It doesn't need to look good.
Can't confirm.
Anyway, thank you.
I will say, though, this is where having a subject matter expert is really nice, not to put too mundane a term in here, because there are skills that I will absolutely say it is easier to do it with the right tools. Like, personally, I think embroidery is way easier with nice embroidery thread. If you go buy the 10-cent poly cotton blend embroidery thread, you're going to struggle and struggle and struggle. So you might want to just spend a couple extra dollars and make an ugly project out of materials that's going to be more cooperative to you. So I think it's nice to have to reach out and ask questions when you are starting a skill like that, because sometimes it does make a difference. Like, you can learn to spin on a CD with a pencil stuck through it, but you might have an easier time with a slightly better tool. So it's always a balancing act of where you put your resources and time. But yeah, I think it's important to remember that we only have a little bit of time. We don't get to spend all day living in this world every single day. So
true. Plus, I hear experts occasionally have extra supplies they might want to share.
I put in my description for my collegium class in 2 weeks, please let me know if you need supplies. I will mail them to you because I'll never use all the stuff I have in my house. So
so true.
I will be honest, I have had a number of occasions where my Laurel has taken me aside to remind me that instead of going and harvesting that stuff yourself, perhaps talk to your Laurel who may already have a number of it in their shed. So definitely worthwhile to talk to those around you who've worked on this stuff before. So the reason I was bringing up the women's workbook is because it made a really big impression on me when it discussed things as simple as how valuable clothing was. Up until pretty much the beginning of modern industrialization, the most pawned thing was items of clothing. And when you break it down and you think about it, even using the more modern looms from, the 18th, 19th century, that kind of thing, these things still took a bunch of manpower, a bunch of time to go from raising the sheep or dealing with your linen crop, getting all of that stuff processed into fiber, which was then made into fabric, which was then dyed. It was this huge thing. So really simple thing you can do for your archaeological experimentation. Something that may be for you like it was for me, something that is kind of intimidating, but is not something that is going to require you to be using a bunch of skills you don't have. But that simple thing might be looking into, how did someone in your period show that they were super fancy? Now, for me, I have a Hebridean Norse persona, and for me, one of the ways that someone in the Hebridean Norse period showed that they were super fancy was to wear clothing of every single color possible, and either as much fabric as possible or as little fabric as possible. So you had two options to show how rich and fancy you were, which was to say, I am going to have clothing that has a ridiculous excess of fabric, like my magnificent have yards of fabric just around each leg. This was a way to show that you had this excess in your trousers, way more than you ever needed. And you would have as many colors on your person as possible to show that, no, I'm not just wearing the clothes that the women in my family who work on this side of things have had time to dye and then help me put together. I am wearing stuff that I have bought. I have access to dyes of different colors, things that are not available in my local area. This was one of the ways that you showed your wealth. One of the other showed your wealth was to have your clothing so tailored that it was like skin tight. There is actually an amazing reference in one of the Viking sagas where there are two men who, one of their compatriots has been injured somehow on the battlefield. And they are trying to figure out, they know it's some kind of leg injury, and they're trying to pull his trousers off and figure out where this injury is. And they have this amazing exchange with each other when they can't get his trousers off, and they're like, man, his trousers are so well tailored. They are so skin tight that we can't even get them off. He must be way richer than we'd ever realized. And they eventually realize, as Vikings do, that the problem is that he has a spear through the leg and they're trying to pull his trousers off around the spear shaft. And it's a very hilarious thing because Vikings love stuff like that. But these are really simple ways that we can say, okay, I'm going to try this thing out, even if it makes me uncomfortable, as a way to say, this is how my persona would have been shown their wealth, and how different is that for me? So for me, because I don't personally feel like I'm the kind of person that anyone wants to see me in skin-tight clothing, I said, I'm going to go with excessive trousers on every color. I'm going to wear ridiculous outfits. I have an outfit that I made specifically because I wanted to make Her Grace Courtland as uncomfortable as possible. And I would like to point out that I failed in this. And so I had a big bird yellow tunic with a green hat, bright pink and white stripy trousers with sky blue leg wraps. And my persona would have loved this, because how else do you show off how wealthy you are other than to wear ridiculously clashing colours and look like a clown? Unfortunately, Her Grace Courtland was not horrified by that, because she knew that it was entirely period appropriate and she was proud of me for putting that together. But you can do these incredibly simple things that don't necessarily involve you learning a whole new intimidating skill. You can take these very small steps to say, I'm going to try out this thing. And then looking at it as a modern person, I can say, I feel really uncomfortable wearing all of these different clashing colors. But my persona would have loved this. So I have learned something. I have learned to be able to say, in the modern world, here is how we are different. We have this modern structure of our clothing has to be very matched. Even if we're wearing bright colors, we have to have bright colors that match each other and can't be too clashing. So there are these very small steps you can take. Now, we're getting low on time here, so I wanted to take a moment and ask if anyone has any quick questions before I go ahead and kind of finish this up and give you guys a couple of things to leave with and think about. Okay, looks like we don't have a lot of big questions. So what I wanted to do is leave you guys with a little bit of a challenge. And so the challenge I want to give you is to pick one small period thing that you want to research and to do in an experimental way so that you can understand your persona's everyday life a little bit better. So I want you to pick something that you know your persona would have been doing, that you yourself do in the modern period, but in a very different way. So something like, one of the big things I've worked on is wearing period shoes. So period shoes are so different from modern shoes. They don't provide all of the different levels of support. They have a very thin sole. So when you're walking on different types of surface, if you're walking on rocks, it feels a little bit more jagged. You're walking on these. I'm not telling you to go out and wear your period shoes all day, every day for a month, because you will wreck your feet. Our modern feet are not used to that. We have not grown up with that. Our muscles, our bones are not defined in the right way to do that. But one thing you can do is you can say, okay, I'm going to go on a walk around my backyard. I'm going to put on my period shoes and I'm going to do a number of laps around my backyard that act up to, a mile. And I'm going to see how different that feels for me than doing that in my modern shoes, and just make notes. One of the projects I started a few years ago was the very first pair of period shoes I made. I started keeping a log of every single time I wore them and for how long on what surfaces. And it's a ridiculous thing to do. I know that. I loved doing it. I know this is not something for everyone. But I was able to sit down and calculate, okay, I have 6 months of continuous wear built up on these shoes over a couple of years, and they are falling apart. And so from there, I can figure out how often my persona would have had to repair or replace their shoes and how valuable shoes might have been. And in doing that, I started working myself up to being able to do things like going out wearing my period shoes the entire time, rather than I'm going to go on a hike and wear modern hiking boots. But I will add the caveat that I spent a lot of time working up to that. I did things like I switched from wearing boots all the time to wearing things like Chucks with much thinner, flexible soles so that I could build myself up all day, every day to being able to wear shoes that my foot had a lot more round. I want you to pick something similar, something really simple, a very small change you can make that you can say, I am understanding how different this is in a period level from my modern level. Whether it be changing some of the ingredients that you're cooking with, whether it be starting to wear a vast array of colors you would not normally wear, but that you know are very popular in period. Even something as simple as saying, hey, I really like coffee. I like straight black espresso. I can't start my day without it. I am going to try making Turkish coffee. And I'm going to start using that and see how different that thing is for me. And what the documentation is in that late period for Turkish coffee and how different that is from what I'm doing right now. I say that as someone who's not a coffee drinker. I don't know how different that will be for you, but you can do something that small and use that as a jump off to say, okay, this is a thing my persona would have done that is different from what I do, and how much do I like it? And those things can make a really big difference. So before I close up the class, does anyone have any questions? Does anyone want to chat on any ideas that they might have for something they want to try doing?
I have a couple business things just before we wrap up. If you haven't yet and you would like credit for Artemisia University, please put your name and your home group in the chat so that we can make sure you get your credit. And this has been recorded, and I will work with Angus on the best way to share this going forward. If you don't want your name or image or whatever in here, please let me know and I can make sure it gets blurred out before we share any video.
Okay, so before we go, I'm going to close out with one sort of more simple thing. I know that I, again, have a bit of a reputation of doing things to a ridiculous degree. And I do that because that's something that I enjoy, that is my personal comfort level, that I love learning from. But I would never want anyone to think that that's how you have to do it. You can do anything using so many period tools and just make one tiny little change to the way you normally do it, whether it be using a more period thread for your embroidery, whether it be trying to use a period needle for your leather working rather than a modern auto punch and thread all, something like that. You can do these little changes and really learn a lot from it. But you would be things that make the biggest differences. When I started doing more period appropriate brewing, yes, I went from I'm gonna hollow out a log by hand and make my own kernel and do all my brewing by hand and all of that. But the one thing that made the biggest difference for me was brewing beer using hops all the time and then switching to where I was using things like juniper or heather as my bittering agent rather than the modern hops. It makes the beer taste completely different. And you hear a lot of people talk about, oh, I would never drink that. That's going to taste weird. Beer with bog myrtle, that sounds terrible. But when you actually try it, you'd be really surprised by how pleasant it can be when you are dropping those modern perspectives. And it leads you on to so many different things. So I started doing this because I wanted to see how different the beer tasted. I was able to end up proving that this idea that period beer was not carbonated and was flat and terrible and not strong at all, I was able to prove that no, my beer is literally exploding any bottles I put it in, because when you're using old school yeast, that is some strong yeast, and the flavors are delicious, and your beer is super carbonated, and it's way more alcoholic than you intended. Doing these small things, you will be surprised at the domino effect of changes that you get and the things that you learn from it and the different comfort levels you get. Now, for any of you who have any questions, please feel free to PM me. I would love to help you. I will more than happily sit down with you and help you figure out a project if you want to try and do some archaeological experimentation, but you're not sure where to start. And before we sign off, I just want to give everyone two quick reminders. One is a reminder to go on and vote for the Populous Choice. Just go to the event page, go look at all of the amazing entries we have. Just like the ones that you want to vote for, and at the end of the day, whoever has the most likes is going to win Populous Choice. And we have people entering from out of kingdom, so this is a great opportunity to go in and look at some of that stuff and really make an effort to kind of big up everyone's art. And then the other final thing is that we are going to be having an after revel tonight. We're going to be having sort of a chat session, and we have everyone join in. And if you need something to make you join in, here's your guilt trip. It's my birthday, and this is my birthday party, so come join me.
Happy birthday.